On the morning of September 11, 2001, the world changed forever. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon in Washington. At 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after passengers fought back against the hijackers. Nearly 3,000 people died that morning. The attacks were the deadliest act of terrorism in human history. They were carried out by 19 hijackers belonging to Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organization based in Afghanistan. The attack shook America to its core. The sense of invulnerability that had characterized American life since World War II was shattered in a single morning. The images of the Twin Towers collapsing, the Pentagon burning, and the smoking crater in Pennsylvania were burned into the collective memory of a generation. Shock and grief gave way to anger. America demanded accountability. America demanded justice. America demanded revenge. President George W. Bush stood on the rubble of the World Trade Center with a bullhorn and told rescue workers and the watching world that the people responsible would hear from America soon. The trail led immediately to Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda's leader, Osama bin Laden, had orchestrated the attacks from his base in that country. Afghanistan was governed by the Taliban, an extreme Islamist movement that had taken power in 1996. The Taliban had provided bin Laden and Al-Qaeda with sanctuary, training camps, and operational freedom. Thousands of terrorists had trained in Afghan camps. They had spread across the world, waiting for orders. The relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was symbiotic. Al-Qaeda provided financial support and international connections. The Taliban provided physical protection and a base of operations. President Bush issued an ultimatum to the Taliban on September 20, 2001. Speaking before a joint session of Congress, he demanded that the Taliban hand over bin Laden and other Al-Qaeda leaders. He demanded the closure of all terrorist training camps. He demanded access for American officials to verify compliance. The Taliban refused. They claimed they could not hand over bin Laden without evidence of his guilt. They offered negotiations. Bush rejected any negotiation. The ultimatum was simple and absolute. Comply or face the consequences. The Taliban chose defiance. The American decision to go to war in Afghanistan was supported by virtually the entire world. NATO invoked Article 5 of its charter for the first time in history, declaring that the September 11th attacks were an attack on all member nations. The United Nations Security Council passed resolutions supporting military action. Russia offered intelligence cooperation. China expressed sympathy. Even Iran, America's bitter enemy, expressed condolences and offered limited assistance. The moral clarity of America's cause was overwhelming. The world stood with America in those first weeks after September 11th. Afghanistan was not an unknown quantity to American policymakers. The country had been a Cold War battlefield for over a decade. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, the United States had covertly supported the Afghan resistance. The CIA funneled billions of dollars in weapons and training to the Mujahideen, the Afghan fighters who resisted Soviet occupation. Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, served as the conduit for this support. Saudi Arabia matched American funding dollar for dollar. The jihad against the Soviet Union became an international cause. The Soviet-Afghan War lasted from 1979 to 1989. It was brutal and destructive beyond imagining. Soviet forces employed tactics of deliberate terror against the civilian population. Villages suspected of supporting the resistance were bombed and burned. Over 1 million Afghans died. 5 million fled to refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran. The country's agricultural system was systematically destroyed. Afghanistan was devastated by a decade of occupation and resistance. The Mujahideen eventually prevailed. The Stinger missiles provided by the CIA denied the Soviets air superiority. Soviet casualties mounted. Public support in the Soviet Union eroded. Mikhail Gorbachev decided the war was unwinnable. Soviet forces withdrew in February 1989. The last Soviet soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge back into Soviet territory. It was a moment of triumph for the Mujahideen and for American Cold War strategy, but the aftermath was catastrophic. After the Soviet withdrawal, the United States largely disengaged from Afghanistan. The Cold War rationale for involvement disappeared. The country was left to its own devices. Civil war erupted among the various Mujahideen factions that had fought the Soviets. The warlords who had been armed and funded by America, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia turned their weapons on each other. Cities were destroyed. Civilians were massacred. The country that had been devastated by Soviet occupation was now being devastated by civil war. Into this chaos came the Taliban. The movement emerged in 1994 from the religious schools, the madrasas, in Pakistan. Many of its founders were veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War. They were inspired by a strict interpretation of Sunni Islam derived from Deobandi and Wahhabi traditions. They promised to end the warlord violence and establish order based on Islamic law. They found support from a population exhausted by years of civil war. They also received critical support from Pakistan's EC and from Saudi Arabia. The Taliban swept through Afghanistan with remarkable speed. They captured Kandahar in 1994. Kabul fell to them in September 1996. The former communist president, Mohammad Najibullah, had been living under UN protection in Kabul. The Taliban dragged him from his refuge. They tortured and killed him. His body was hung from a traffic light in a public square. The message was clear. The old order was finished. A new and brutal regime had taken power. Taliban rule was harsh and repressive beyond anything Afghanistan had previously experienced. Women were banned from education and employment. They could not leave their homes without a male guardian. Female doctors were barred from practicing, leaving women without access to medical care. Girls' schools were closed. Music was banned. Television was banned. Flying kites was banned. The Taliban's religious police, the morality enforcers, patrolled the streets and beat those who violated their rules. The Taliban destroyed Afghanistan's pre-Islamic cultural heritage. In March 2001, they blew up the Bamiyan Buddhas to massive statues carved into a cliff face in central Afghanistan. The statues were over 1,500 years old. They were considered irreplaceable masterpieces of human civilization. The Taliban declared them idolatrous and destroyed them with artillery and explosives. The world watched in horror. The destruction of the Buddhas was a declaration of war against human civilization itself. Osama bin Laden had arrived in Afghanistan in 1996. He had previously been based in Sudan. International pressure had forced Sudan to expel him. The Taliban welcomed him. He established his base in Kandahar, the Taliban's spiritual capital. He built training camps. He recruited fighters from across the Muslim world. He planned terrorist operations against American targets. The 1998 bombings of American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania killed 224 people. The 2000 attack on the USS Cole killed 17 American sailors. Al-Qaeda was growing more ambitious and more lethal. The Clinton administration had recognized the threat. They had launched cruise missile strikes against Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan in 1998. The strikes killed some fighters but missed bin Laden. There were discussions about more aggressive action. There were plans for special operations missions against al-Qaeda, but nothing decisive was done. The political will for a major military intervention in Afghanistan was not there. The Somalia experience in 1993, where American forces had been killed and dragged through the streets, made American politicians extremely cautious about military interventions in distant countries. When George W. Bush took office in January 2001, his national security team was focused on other priorities. China, missile defense, and Russia occupied their attention. The threat from al-Qaeda was recognized but not prioritized. National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice was briefed on al-Qaeda threats but saw them as a secondary concern. CIA Director George Tenet warned repeatedly that the threat was serious and growing. His warnings were not acted upon with sufficient urgency. The system was, as Tenet later said, blinking red with warnings of an imminent attack. But the specific nature and timing of the attack remained unknown. The September 11th attacks transformed these priorities instantly and completely. Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan moved to the top of every agenda. The Bush administration's response was swift and comprehensive. The CIA was authorized to pursue al-Qaeda by any means necessary. The military began planning operations. Diplomats worked to build international support. Intelligence agencies shared information. The full weight of American government was being turned toward a small, landlocked, desperately poor country in Central Asia. CIA officers were the first Americans to enter Afghanistan after September 11th. They arrived in late September and early October 2001. They made contact with the Northern Alliance, a coalition of Afghan warlords and factions that had been fighting the Taliban since 1996. The Northern Alliance controlled only about 10% of Afghan territory, mostly in the north of the country. But they had fighters, local knowledge, and a burning desire to defeat the Taliban. CIA officers arrived with bags of cash and satellite phones. They began the process of building a military coalition. The Northern Alliance was a diverse and often fractious group. It included Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, and some Pashtuns. They were united primarily by their opposition to the Taliban. Their leaders included figures like General Abdul Rashid Dostum, a brutal Uzbek warlord with a history of atrocities. Ismail Khan controlled western Afghanistan. Ahmed Shah Massoud had been the alliance's most capable military commander. But Massoud had been assassinated by al-Qaeda operatives on September 9, 2001, just 2 days before the September 11th attacks. His loss was a severe blow to the alliance. The American military plan for Afghanistan was unconventional. Rather than deploying large numbers of ground troops immediately, the strategy relied on special operations forces working with local Afghan allies. Small teams of Green Berets and CIA officers would embed with Northern Alliance units. They would call in airstrikes from American aircraft. The combination of Afghan ground forces and American air power would create a lethal and effective fighting combination. It was a model that drew on lessons from previous irregular warfare. It was also faster and cheaper than conventional deployment. American airstrikes began on October 7, 2001. Aircraft from carriers in the Arabian Sea and land bases in the region struck Taliban military positions, air defenses, and al-Qaeda training camps. Cruise missiles struck targets in Kabul, Kandahar, and other cities. The Taliban had minimal air defenses. Their radar and communications infrastructure was destroyed within days. American aircraft operated freely over Afghan skies. The strikes began systematically degrading Taliban military capacity. The initial phase of the war seemed to stall in October 2001. The airstrikes continued, but the Taliban remained in control of most of the country. Critics began to question the strategy. There was talk of a quagmire. Memories of the Soviet experience in Afghanistan were invoked. Military analysts suggested the campaign was failing, but the criticism was premature. The combination of American air power, Special Operations Forces, and Northern Alliance ground forces was just beginning to show its potential. The breakthrough came in November 2001. Northern Alliance forces, supported by American airstrikes and Special Operations teams calling in targets, began to advance rapidly. On November 9th, Mazar-i-Sharif, the major northern city, fell to Northern Alliance forces. The city had been a Taliban stronghold. Its fall opened the route south and created momentum. Afghan fighters who had been on the fence began switching sides. The Taliban's grip on the country began to loosen. The fall of Mazar-i-Sharif triggered a cascade of Taliban collapses. City after city fell in rapid succession. On November 12th, Kabul was abandoned by the Taliban. Northern Alliance forces entered the capital to jubilant crowds. Women appeared in public without burqas for the first time in years. Men shaved their beards. Music played in the streets. The scenes of liberation were genuinely moving. After 5 years of Taliban oppression, Afghanistan's cities were free. The Taliban retreated to their stronghold in Kandahar and to the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. The most critical phase of the war was approaching. Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda's leadership were believed to be in the White Mountains of eastern Afghanistan, near the Pakistani border. An area called Tora Bora was identified as their likely location. The mountains there rose to over 14,000 feet. They were honeycombed with caves and tunnels built during the Soviet-Afghan War with CIA assistance. It was an ideal hiding place for a man who understood the terrain. The Battle of Tora Bora began in early December 2001. American Special Operations Forces called in massive airstrikes on the mountain positions. The bombing was relentless and devastating. But the ground assault was left primarily to Afghan militia forces rather than American troops. These forces were unreliable. They accepted bribes from al-Qaeda fighters to allow safe passage through the mountains. The militia commanders negotiated truces that allowed al-Qaeda fighters to escape into Pakistan. Osama bin Laden slipped through the net and crossed into Pakistan. The failure to capture or kill bin Laden at Tora Bora was one of the most consequential decisions of the entire war. The debate over whether sufficient American forces were committed to the battle has continued ever since. Military commanders on the ground had requested additional American forces to seal the Pakistani border. General Tommy Franks, commanding the overall campaign, declined to commit more forces. The opportunity to end al-Qaeda's leadership at its moment of maximum vulnerability was lost. The Taliban government was overthrown by December 2001. A new political process began to shape Afghanistan's future. A conference in Bonn, Germany, brought together Afghan leaders from various factions. They agreed on a framework for establishing a new government. Hamid Karzai, a Pashtun leader with tribal connections and a mild manner, emerged as the choice for interim leader. He was acceptable to various factions and to the international community. He was inaugurated as chairman of the interim administration on December 22, 2001. The initial phase of the war had been a stunning military success. The Taliban had been overthrown in just 2 months. Al-Qaeda's infrastructure had been devastated. Afghanistan had a new government and the prospect of a different future. The cost to American forces had been remarkably low. A handful of Americans had been killed in combat. Dozens more died in accidents. The efficiency of the campaign seemed to vindicate the strategy of combining special operations forces, air power, and local allies. But the foundations of this apparent success were deeply unstable. The Taliban had not been defeated. They had retreated into Pakistan, where the EC gave them sanctuary and support. Al-Qaeda had not been destroyed. Its leadership had escaped. The new Afghan government was weak and dependent on warlords who had their own agendas. The country was devastated by 2 decades of war. Rebuilding it would require sustained commitment of resources and attention that the United States was not prepared to provide. The seeds of future failure were planted in the soil of early success. The year 2000 began with cautious optimism about Afghanistan's future. The Taliban had been swept from power, a new government was taking shape. International donors pledged billions of dollars for reconstruction. Aid organizations flooded into the country, schools reopened. Girls returned to classrooms for the first time in years. Women emerged from behind their burqas. The streets of Kabul hummed with the energy of a people released from oppression. The future seemed genuinely possible. But this optimism masked deep and dangerous problems that would soon reassert themselves with devastating force. The Bonn Agreement that had established Afghanistan's transitional government was a political framework built on fragile foundations. The agreement distributed power among various Afghan factions and warlords. It was a necessary compromise to achieve short-term stability, but it embedded the power of armed factions into the new political structure. The warlords who had fought the Taliban became governors, ministers, and military commanders in the new government. They brought their militias, their loyalties, and their corruption with them. The new Afghanistan was built on the same unstable foundations as the old one. Hamid Karzai faced an almost impossible task. He was leading a government that controlled little territory outside Kabul. The provinces were dominated by warlords who paid lip service to Karzai's authority while pursuing their own interests. Ismail Khan controlled Herat in the west like a personal fiefdom. Abdul Rashid Dostum dominated the north. Gul Agha Shirzai controlled much of Kandahar. These men collected taxes, ran their own security forces, and answered to Kabul only when it suited them. Karzai's government was simultaneously the legitimate authority and a marginalized actor in its own country. The international security presence in Afghanistan was initially limited and geographically confined. The International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, was established in December 2001 under the Bonn Agreement. Its initial mandate was to provide security only in Kabul and its immediate surroundings. The force was relatively small, numbering only a few thousand troops. It was commanded by rotating leadership from various NATO nations. The security of the rest of the country was left to a combination of American forces pursuing al-Qaeda and unreliable Afghan militias. The American military in Afghanistan was focused narrowly on counterterrorism. Their mission was to find and destroy the remnants of al-Qaeda and the Taliban. They conducted raids on suspected militant hideouts. They gathered intelligence. They called in airstrikes. They were not focused on reconstruction or governance. They were hunters looking for an enemy that had largely melted away into the population and across the border into Pakistan. The war had shifted from conventional combat to a shadowy counterterrorism mission. The situation in Pakistan was critical and deeply problematic. After September 11th, Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf had sided with America and against the Taliban. He had allowed American forces to use Pakistani bases and airspace. He had provided intelligence cooperation. He had arrested several senior al-Qaeda figures. But Musharraf's support was selective and ambiguous. The Pakistani military establishment, particularly the EC, had deep institutional ties to the Taliban. They had created and supported the Taliban throughout the 1990s. These relationships did not end when Musharraf changed sides. The Taliban leadership retreated to Quetta in Pakistan's Balochistan province. This group became known as the Quetta Shura, the Taliban's governing council in exile. They regrouped, recruited, and planned for their return to Afghanistan. The EC tolerated and, in many cases, actively supported this process. Pakistani military officials attended Taliban funerals and weddings. Pakistani madrasas continued to produce recruits for the Taliban. The border between Afghanistan and Pakistan was porous and effectively uncontrolled. The Taliban's sanctuary in Pakistan was the single most important factor in their eventual resurgence. America's attention was shifting away from Afghanistan by 2002. The Bush administration was increasingly focused on Iraq. The argument that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and supported terrorism was gaining traction within the administration. Planning for a potential invasion of Iraq was consuming enormous amounts of military and intelligence resources. Key personnel, including special operations forces and intelligence assets, were being pulled from Afghanistan to prepare for Iraq. This shift of attention and resources had profound consequences. The Iraq War began in March 2003. Within weeks, Baghdad had fallen and Saddam Hussein's statue had been pulled down. The rapid military success reinforced the administration's confidence that Iraq was the more important priority. Afghanistan seemed under control. The Taliban had not yet remounted a significant challenge. The Karzai government was functioning, however imperfectly. The decision was made to keep resources focused on Iraq. Afghanistan would have to make do with less. This decision condemned Afghanistan 2 years of neglect at a critical moment. The window for consolidating military victory and building viable institutions was narrow. It required sustained investment of resources and attention. Instead, Afghanistan received neither. The American military presence was kept deliberately small. Economic aid fell far short of pledges. The Afghan National Army and police were trained slowly and inadequately. The institutions of governance were built on sand. When the Taliban began their comeback, they found a country whose government could barely function and whose security forces could barely fight. The reconstruction effort that did occur was often poorly designed and poorly executed. American and international aid was channeled through a complex web of contractors and subcontractors. Enormous amounts of money were wasted on projects that were inappropriate, poorly built, or quickly abandoned. Roads were built that fell apart within months. Schools were constructed without teachers or books. Agricultural projects ignored local farming practices. The disconnect between the intentions of aid donors and the realities on the ground was enormous. Corruption became the defining feature of Afghan governance. Karzai's government was riddled with corruption at every level. Government positions were sold to the highest bidder. Customs revenues disappeared into private pockets. Police commanders shook down the population they were supposed to protect. Judges sold their verdicts. The corruption was not simply an Afghan cultural failing. It was actively enabled by the flood of international money that poured into the country with inadequate oversight. American money funded Afghan corruption on a massive scale. The drug trade compounded these problems. Afghanistan had been the world's leading opium producer before the Taliban came to power. The Taliban had actually suppressed opium production significantly. After their overthrow, opium production exploded. By 2006, Afghanistan was producing over 90% of the world's heroin. Warlords and government officials were deeply involved in the drug trade. The opium economy provided funding for the Taliban's resurgence. It corrupted government officials at every level. It undermined every effort to build legitimate governance. The Taliban watched the deteriorating situation carefully from their Pakistani sanctuaries. They saw weak and corrupt government. They saw security forces that were inadequate and poorly motivated. They saw a population frustrated with broken promises and continued poverty. They saw an international presence that was divided and increasingly distracted by Iraq. They began to plan their return. The conditions that had brought them to power in the first place, chaos, corruption, and a population desperate for order, were reasserting themselves. The Taliban's resurgence began slowly in 2003 and 2004. Small groups of fighters began crossing from Pakistan into southern and eastern Afghanistan. They conducted hit-and-run attacks on Afghan government forces and international troops. They assassinated local officials and tribal leaders who cooperated with the government. They intimidated communities into silence and complicity. The attacks were small in scale but significant in their implications. The Taliban were demonstrating that they could operate inside Afghanistan again. American forces in Afghanistan shifted their focus as the Taliban threat grew. Operation Enduring Freedom continued its pursuit of al-Qaeda and Taliban leadership. Special Operations Forces conducted night raids on suspected militant compounds. Intelligence gathering intensified. The CIA expanded its presence. Drone strikes began targeting militant leaders in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. The first drone strike in Pakistan occurred in 2004. These strikes would become a central feature of American strategy in the coming years. The drone program represented a fundamental shift in how America approached the conflict. Unmanned aerial vehicles, particularly the Predator and later the Reaper, could loiter over targets for hours and strike with precision-guided missiles. They could operate in areas where conventional forces could not go, including inside Pakistan. The strikes killed numerous al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders, but they also killed civilians. Each civilian death created new enemies and undermined the political goals that military operations were supposed to support. The drone program was simultaneously effective and counterproductive. The presidential election of 2004 marked an important moment in Afghanistan's political development. Hamid Karzai won the election with 55% of the vote. The election was imperfect, marred by fraud and intimidation in some areas. But millions of Afghans participated. Women voted in large numbers. The images of Afghans holding up ink-stained fingers, showing they had voted, were genuinely moving. Democracy was taking root, however imperfectly. The election provided Karzai with legitimacy and renewed international commitment. But the Taliban were also developing politically. They established shadow governments in areas where they operated. They appointed shadow governors and judges. They offered a form of rough justice that was brutal but swift and corruption-free. In communities where the official government was absent or predatory, Taliban courts and administrators provided services the government did not. This shadow governance gave the Taliban legitimacy in the eyes of some Afghans. They were not just terrorists. They were an alternative government waiting to return. The year 2005 brought parliamentary elections that further developed Afghanistan's democratic institutions. The National Assembly convened for the first time in decades. It included women representatives mandated by the Constitution. It included former warlords, technocrats, and tribal leaders. It was chaotic, fractious, and often dysfunctional, but it was real. Afghans were debating their future through democratic processes. This was a genuine achievement that deserved more attention than it received. The security situation was deteriorating despite these political developments. Insurgent attacks increased dramatically in 2005 and 2006. The Taliban focused particularly on Helmand and Kandahar provinces in the south. These were Pashtun heartlands where the Taliban had their deepest roots. The weak presence of government forces and the extensive opium economy made these areas ideal for Taliban operations. By 2006, entire districts in Helmand were effectively controlled by the Taliban. NATO took over responsibility for security in southern Afghanistan in 2006. British forces deployed to Helmand province. Canadian forces deployed to Kandahar. Dutch forces went to Uruzgan. These deployments were part of ISAF's expansion from Kabul to cover the entire country. But the NATO forces arrived with different mandates, different rules of engagement, and different levels of military capability. Some nations severely restricted what their troops could do. German forces, for example, were not allowed to conduct offensive operations. This patchwork of restrictions made coordinated military action extremely difficult. The British deployment to Helmand was a case study in the war's complexities. British forces arrived expecting a relatively benign environment where reconstruction could proceed under military protection. They found instead a full-scale insurgency. Taliban forces attacked their bases and patrol routes. The fighting was intense and casualties mounted. The British found themselves fighting a war rather than supporting development. Plans for reconstruction gave way to daily battles for survival. Helmand became one of the bloodiest theaters of the entire war. The Battle of Musakala in 2006 illustrated the difficulties facing NATO forces. British troops established a presence in this Helmand district center. They were immediately besieged by Taliban forces. The battle continued for months with heavy casualties on both sides. Eventually, the British negotiated a deal with local tribal leaders to withdraw in exchange for promises that Taliban would not enter the town. The deal collapsed within months. Taliban forces returned. British forces had to fight their way back into Musakala in 2007. The episode showed how difficult it was to hold ground against a determined and locally rooted insurgency. American forces were also fighting hard in eastern Afghanistan. The provinces of Kunar, Nuristan, Paksha, and Khost were scenes of intense fighting. Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces launched complex attacks on American bases and patrols. Improvised explosive devices, IEDs, became the primary weapon of the insurgency. These homemade bombs, buried in roads and fields, killed and maimed American and coalition soldiers with devastating effectiveness. The IED threat transformed how coalition forces operated. Vehicles were armored, routes were swept for bombs. Every patrol became a terrifying exercise in vigilance. The Battle of Wainit in July 2008 was one of the most intense engagements of the Eastern Campaign. American forces had established a new patrol base in Nuristan province. On July 13th, approximately 200 Taliban fighters launched a coordinated attack on the base. 9 American soldiers were killed and 27 wounded. It was one of the deadliest attacks on American forces since the war began. The battle demonstrated the Taliban's increasing sophistication and capability. They were not a spent force. They were growing stronger and more effective. The political situation in America was also changing. The Iraq War had become deeply unpopular. The Bush administration was under intense pressure. The 2006 midterm elections gave Democrats control of Congress largely because of opposition to the Iraq War. The surge strategy in Iraq, announced in January 2007, was consuming enormous resources and attention. Afghanistan remained the secondary theater. The Taliban continued to gain ground while American attention remained focused elsewhere. General David Petraeus had overseen the surge in Iraq with considerable success. The surge combined additional troops with a new counterinsurgency strategy. It emphasized protecting the population rather than simply killing the enemy. It sought to peel off reconcilable elements of the insurgency through political engagement and economic incentives. It worked reasonably well in Iraq because of specific conditions in that country. The question was whether a similar approach could work in Afghanistan. Barack Obama was elected president in November 2008. He had campaigned partly on the argument that Iraq was the wrong war and Afghanistan was the right one. He promised to refocus American strategy on Afghanistan. He ordered a comprehensive review of Afghan policy immediately upon taking office. The review revealed the depth of the problem. The Taliban controlled large swaths of the south and east. The Afghan government was dysfunctional and corrupt. The Afghan security forces were inadequate. Pakistan continued to provide sanctuary to the Taliban. There were no easy answers and no quick fixes. The Obama administration faced a stark choice. It could attempt to turn the war around with a major surge of forces and resources. Or it could scale back American ambitions and accept a more limited outcome. The military, led by General Stanley McChrystal, requested 40,000 additional troops for a comprehensive counterinsurgency campaign. Vice President Joe Biden argued for a more limited counterterrorism approach that would avoid large troop commitments. The debate within the administration was intense and consequential. Obama chose a middle path that satisfied no one completely. He announced in December 2009 that 30,000 additional American troops would be deployed to Afghanistan. This brought total American forces to nearly 100,000, but he also announced that American forces would begin withdrawing in July 2011. The surge was time-limited from the moment it was announced. This undermined the strategy's credibility. Afghan leaders and Taliban commanders both understood that America was looking for an exit. The question was not whether America would leave, but when. The surge of 2010 and 2011 achieved significant tactical successes. Operation Moshtarak in Helmand's Marja district in February 2010 was the largest offensive of the war. Thousands of American, British, and Afghan forces swept through Taliban-controlled areas. They cleared the Taliban from Marja and established a government presence. The operation demonstrated improved coordination between coalition forces and Afghan security forces. Similar operations followed in Kandahar province. The Taliban were pushed from population centers and forced into rural areas. But the tactical successes did not translate into strategic progress. The Taliban simply waited. They had time. America did not. The announcement of withdrawal timelines told the Taliban that they only needed to survive until American forces left. The Afghan population understood this as well. People who might have supported the government took note that America was leaving. Betting on a government that America was abandoning was a dangerous proposition. Support for the Taliban, whether voluntary or coerced, continued in many areas. The year 2011 marked a turning point in the Afghanistan war. The surge had achieved its tactical objectives but failed to deliver strategic progress. American forces were preparing to withdraw. President Obama's announcement that troops would begin leaving in July 2011 had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the conflict. The Taliban understood they only needed to wait. Afghan civilians understood America was leaving. Government officials understood their future was uncertain. The war had entered a new phase, one defined by countdown clocks and diminishing American commitment. The most significant event of 2011 occurred not on the battlefield, but in a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. On May 2, 2011, American Navy SEALs conducted Operation Neptune Spear. They raided a large walled compound where intelligence indicated Osama bin Laden was hiding. After a brief firefight, bin Laden was killed. His body was taken back to Afghanistan for identification and then buried at sea. The operation was a remarkable intelligence and military achievement. It closed the chapter on the man who had orchestrated the September 11th attacks. Bin Laden's death should have been a moment of triumph, but it was met with surprising ambivalence. Many Americans felt relief rather than celebration. The war had dragged on for 10 years. Thousands of American soldiers had died. Tens of thousands more had been wounded. Trillions of dollars had been spent. Bin Laden's death did not end the war or make the sacrifices feel worthwhile. It was a symbolic victory that changed little on the ground in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda had already decentralized. Other leaders remained active. The organization continued to operate from Pakistan and elsewhere. The withdrawal of American forces began as scheduled in July 2011. The process was gradual but inexorable. Combat units began rotating home. Bases were closed or handed over to Afghan forces. Equipment was packed up and shipped out. The withdrawal created both practical and psychological challenges. Afghan security forces had to take responsibility for areas previously secured by Americans. This transition was often rocky. Afghan forces suffered heavy casualties as they took the brunt of Taliban attacks. Morale fluctuated wildly. The psychological impact of the withdrawal was even more significant. For Afghan civilians, the departure of American forces signaled that the government might not survive. People who had cooperated with the government became fearful. They worried about retribution when the Taliban returned. Many stopped cooperating with government programs. Others began making arrangements with the Taliban to ensure their safety. The government's legitimacy eroded as American presence diminished. For the Taliban, the withdrawal confirmed their strategy. They had always believed time was on their side. America would eventually tire of the war and leave. The announced withdrawal schedule proved them right. They adjusted their tactics accordingly. Rather than trying to hold territory against superior American firepower, they focused on assassinations, intimidation, and political subversion. They targeted government officials, teachers, health workers, and anyone else associated with the government. They sought to undermine governance rather than defeat the army. The Afghan National Security Forces were supposed to be ready to take over security responsibilities. Billions of dollars had been spent training and equipping them. Hundreds of American advisors worked with Afghan units, but the results were mixed at best. The Afghan National Army was relatively effective in conventional operations. Its soldiers fought bravely and suffered enormous casualties. But the force was plagued by poor leadership, corruption, and high desertion rates. Units often existed only on paper. Commanders inflated troop numbers to collect extra pay and supplies. The Afghan National Police were even more problematic. Many police units were essentially local militias under the control of warlords or corrupt officials. Training was minimal, discipline was poor, corruption was endemic. Police commanders often forced their men to pay for their positions and then demanded a share of whatever bribes they collected. The police were frequently more feared than respected by the population they were supposed to protect. Building an effective police force proved far more difficult than building an army. The transition process, called Intikal Indari, was supposed to be carefully managed. Provinces and districts were to be handed over to Afghan control only when conditions were right. In practice, the transition was driven more by political timelines than military readiness. Districts were declared ready for transition even when security conditions were deteriorating. The result was that Afghan forces were often left to defend areas they could not hold. The Taliban exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly. The year 2012 saw increasing violence across Afghanistan. As American forces withdrew from rural areas, the Taliban moved in. They established shadow governments in many districts. They collected taxes. They administered justice. They provided services the government could not. In some areas, they were less corrupt and more efficient than the official government. This gave them a degree of popular acceptance, however grudging. The Taliban were not just an insurgent group, they were becoming a parallel government. The assassination of Burhanuddin Rabbani in September 2011 was a devastating blow to peace efforts. Rabbani was a former president and the head of Afghanistan's High Peace Council, which was tasked with negotiating with the Taliban. He was killed by a suicide bomber posing as a peace envoy. The attack demonstrated the Taliban's unwillingness to engage in genuine negotiations. It also showed their ability to strike at the highest levels of the Afghan government. The peace process effectively collapsed after Rabbani's death. American efforts to negotiate directly with the Taliban also stalled. Secret talks had been ongoing since 2010. The Taliban insisted on dealing directly with the United States rather than through the Afghan government. They viewed Karzi's government as illegitimate. The Americans were reluctant to negotiate without including the Afghan government. The talks made little progress. The fundamental issues were irreconcilable. The Taliban demanded complete withdrawal of foreign forces. The Americans demanded guarantees that Afghanistan would not again become a terrorist safe haven. Neither side was willing to compromise. The relationship between the United States and Pakistan deteriorated significantly during this period. American frustration with Pakistan's support for the Taliban reached new heights. The Bin Laden raid had been conducted without informing Pakistani authorities. This breach of sovereignty infuriated the Pakistani military establishment. Relations worsened further in November 2011 when American aircraft mistakenly attacked a Pakistani border post, killing 24 soldiers. Pakistan closed NATO supply routes through its territory in retaliation. The routes remained closed for 7 months, severely disrupting logistics. The drone campaign in Pakistan intensified during this period. American Predator and Reaper drones conducted hundreds of strikes in Pakistan's tribal areas. The strikes killed numerous Taliban and Al-Qaeda leaders, but they also killed civilians. Each civilian death generated outrage in Pakistan and undermined cooperation with the United States. The drone program became a major source of tension between the two countries. Pakistani politicians condemned the strikes as violations of sovereignty. The Pakistani public increasingly viewed America as an enemy rather than an ally. The year 2012 also saw growing tensions between American forces and the Afghan population. A series of incidents damaged relations. In February, an American soldier went on a rampage in Panjwai district, killing 16 Afghan civilians, mostly women and children. The massacre sparked widespread protests and condemnation. In April, American soldiers were photographed urinating on dead Taliban fighters. The images went viral and caused international outrage. In September, protests erupted across Afghanistan after an anti-Islamic video produced in America sparked anger throughout the Muslim world. These incidents reflected deeper problems. American forces were tired and frustrated after more than a decade of war. Rules of engagement had become increasingly restrictive in an attempt to reduce civilian casualties. Soldiers felt they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. The cultural gap between American troops and Afghan civilians was enormous. Misunderstandings and mistrust were constant. The longer the war continued, the more difficult it became to maintain positive relations. President Hamid Karzai's relationship with the United States deteriorated dramatically. Karzai had initially been grateful for American support. But as his presidency continued, he grew increasingly resentful of American influence. He accused America of undermining Afghan sovereignty. He blamed America for the corruption in his government. He criticized American military operations that caused civilian casualties. He played to nationalist sentiment by positioning himself as standing up to American pressure. This stance was popular with many Afghans who resented the foreign presence. Karzai's behavior became increasingly erratic. He made wild accusations against America and its allies. He threatened to join the Taliban. He refused to sign agreements that had been negotiated by his own government. He surrounded himself with sycophants and shut out competent advisors. His mental state was questioned by diplomats and officials. Some suggested he was suffering from paranoia or other psychological problems. Whatever the cause, his leadership became an obstacle to progress rather than a force for stability. The presidential election of 2014 was a critical moment for Afghanistan. Karzai was constitutionally barred from running for a third term. The election would determine who would lead Afghanistan into the post-American era. Two main candidates emerged. Ashraf Ghani was a technocrat who had worked for the World Bank and served as finance minister. Abdullah Abdullah was a former foreign minister and close associate of the martyred Ahmad Shah Massoud. Both men represented different visions for Afghanistan's future. The election was marred by massive fraud. Both sides engaged in ballot stuffing and other irregularities. The initial results showed Ghani winning. Abdullah cried foul and threatened to establish a parallel government. The situation threatened to plunge Afghanistan into civil conflict. Secretary of State John Kerry flew to Kabul to mediate. After intense negotiations, a power-sharing agreement was reached. Ghani would become president. Abdullah would become chief executive officer, a newly created position with vaguely defined powers. The deal prevented immediate crisis but created long-term governance problems. The withdrawal of American combat forces was completed at the end of 2014. The mission officially transitioned from Operation Enduring Freedom to Operation Resolute Support. The focus shifted from combat to training and advising Afghan forces. Approximately 9,800 American troops remained in Afghanistan, along with several thousand troops from NATO allies. Their mission was to train, advise, and assist Afghan forces. They were not supposed to engage in combat except in self-defense or to protect Afghan forces and extremists. The withdrawal of combat forces coincided with a major escalation of Taliban activity. Freed from the pressure of American combat operations, the Taliban launched a nationwide offensive. They attacked district centers, police stations, and army bases. They assassinated government officials and tribal leaders. They seized territory in rural areas. The Afghan security forces struggled to respond. Casualties mounted to unsustainable levels. The attrition rate was staggering. Entire units were wiped out in single engagements. The Battle of Kunduz in September 2015 was a shocking demonstration of the Taliban's growing strength. Kunduz was a provincial capital in northern Afghanistan. It had never been seriously threatened by the Taliban before. But in September 2015, Taliban forces launched a coordinated assault on the city. Afghan forces were overwhelmed. The Taliban captured Kunduz and held it for several days. It was the first provincial capital to fall to the Taliban since 2001. The capture sent shockwaves through Afghanistan and the international community. American forces had to intervene to help retake Kunduz. Special operations forces and air power supported Afghan counterattacks. After several days of intense fighting, the city was recaptured. But the damage was done. The myth of Taliban weakness had been shattered. The vulnerability of Afghan forces had been exposed. The idea that Afghan forces could hold territory without American combat support was proven false. The Taliban had demonstrated they could seize and hold major urban centers. The Kunduz debacle led to a reassessment of American strategy. The Obama administration had planned to reduce American forces to 5,500 by the end of 2015. That plan was abandoned. Instead, approximately 9,800 troops remained through 2016. The rules of engagement were loosened to allow American forces to provide more direct support to Afghan units. American Special Operations Forces began accompanying Afghan units on offensive operations. American aircraft conducted more strikes in support of Afghan ground forces. The distinction between combat and non-combat missions blurred significantly. The year 2016 saw continued deterioration of the security situation. The Taliban controlled or contested more territory than at any time since 2001. According to various estimates, the Taliban controlled between 10 and 15% of Afghan districts outright. They contested another 30%. The government controlled less than half the country. Casualties among Afghan security forces reached catastrophic levels. An estimated 6,785 Afghan soldiers and police were killed in 2016 alone. The attrition rate was unsustainable. Recruitment could not keep pace with losses. The drug trade continued to fuel the conflict. Afghanistan remained the world's leading producer of opium. The harvest reached record levels in 2016. The opium economy provided funding for the Taliban, corrupt officials, and criminal networks. It undermined every effort at governance and development. Eradication efforts had failed spectacularly. Alternative livelihood programs had limited success. The drug trade was deeply embedded in the Afghan economy and society. It was a problem that defied solution. Corruption remained the defining feature of Afghan governance. President Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah presided over a government riddled with corruption at every level. The power-sharing arrangement created constant friction and paralysis. Ministries were divided between the two camps. Appointments were based on political loyalty rather than competence. Basic services were neglected. The government's legitimacy continued to erode. The humanitarian situation deteriorated as the conflict intensified. Millions of Afghans were displaced by fighting. Refugee camps filled with families fleeing violence. Food insecurity increased as farmers abandoned their fields. Access to healthcare and education declined in conflict zones. Children suffered disproportionately. Malnutrition rates rose. Schools were closed or destroyed. A generation of Afghan children was growing up without education or hope. American domestic politics also affected the war. The 2016 presidential election brought Donald Trump to power. Trump had campaigned on ending America's endless wars. He promised to bring American troops home. But he also promised to defeat terrorism. These promises were contradictory. His administration conducted a review of Afghan policy in 2017. The review concluded that America needed to stay in Afghanistan to prevent terrorist threats. But the commitment was framed in terms of protecting American interests rather than building a democratic Afghanistan. In August 2017, President Trump announced his new strategy for Afghanistan. He authorized a modest increase in American forces, bringing the total to approximately 14,000. He gave military commanders greater authority to conduct operations. He emphasized killing terrorists rather than nation building. He demanded that Pakistan stop providing sanctuary to the Taliban. He warned that America would not repeat the mistakes of premature withdrawal. The speech was notable for its pessimism. Trump said he was not announcing a victory. He was announcing a change in approach. The new strategy achieved limited tactical successes. American forces conducted more aggressive operations against the Taliban and other militant groups. Drone strikes increased. Special operations raids intensified. The Taliban suffered heavy casualties, but the strategic situation did not improve. The Taliban continued to control and contest large areas of the country. The Afghan government remained weak and corrupt. Pakistan continued to provide sanctuary to the Taliban. The fundamental dynamics of the conflict remained unchanged. The year 2018 saw the beginning of direct negotiations between the United States and the Taliban. Zalmay Khalilzad, a veteran diplomat, was appointed as special envoy for Afghanistan reconciliation. He began meeting with Taliban representatives in Doha, Qatar. The talks were kept secret initially. The Afghan government was largely excluded. The Taliban refused to negotiate with what they considered an illegitimate puppet regime. The talks focused on two main issues: American withdrawal and Taliban guarantees that Afghanistan would not be used as a base for attacks against America. The exclusion of the Afghan government from the talks was controversial. President Ghani protested that his government was being sidelined. Many Afghans felt betrayed by America. The talks seemed to confirm that America was looking for a way out regardless of the consequences for Afghanistan. The Taliban used the talks to their advantage. They portrayed themselves as the legitimate representatives of the Afghan people. They demanded complete withdrawal of foreign forces as a precondition for any political settlement. The talks progressed slowly but steadily through 2018 and 2019. The Taliban agreed to reduce attacks on American forces. Violence against Afghan forces and civilians continued unabated. The Taliban made vague promises about preventing terrorist groups from operating in Afghanistan. They refused to agree to a ceasefire or to negotiate with the Afghan government. The American side insisted on guarantees against terrorism. They were willing to discuss withdrawal timelines, but wanted those timelines linked to Taliban actions. The year 2019 saw the peace negotiations between the United States and the Taliban intensify. The talks in Doha became the centerpiece of American strategy in Afghanistan. Zalmay Khalilzad shuttled between Qatar, Kabul, and regional capitals. He met repeatedly with Taliban negotiators, Afghan government officials, and regional partners. The goal was to achieve a negotiated settlement that would allow American forces to withdraw while preventing Afghanistan from again becoming a terrorist sanctuary. The gap between those objectives proved difficult to bridge. The Doha talks were conducted in secrecy with occasional announcements of progress. The Taliban negotiating team was led by Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, one of the movement's co-founders who had been released from Pakistani custody in 2018. The American side focused on obtaining specific guarantees regarding terrorism. The Taliban focused on obtaining a concrete timeline for complete American military withdrawal. These two issues became the core of the negotiations. President Ghani and the Afghan government watched the Doha process with growing alarm. They were being excluded from negotiations about their country's future. The Taliban refused to negotiate directly with the Afghan government. They considered it an American puppet. The Americans tried to reassure Ghani that any agreement would require intra-Afghan negotiations between the government and the Taliban. But the sequencing was clear. America would negotiate its withdrawal with the Taliban first. Only then would Afghans negotiate with each other. By September 2019, Khalilzad announced that an agreement in principle had been reached. The Taliban would provide guarantees against terrorism. America would withdraw its forces over a 14-month period. The Afghan government would release thousands of Taliban prisoners. Intra-Afghan negotiations would begin after the initial agreement was signed. President Trump was ready to sign the deal. He invited Taliban leaders to Camp David for a signing ceremony. Then, Trump abruptly canceled the Camp David meeting. A Taliban attack in Kabul killed an American soldier. Trump declared the talks dead. He tweeted that the Taliban had admitted to the attack and boasted about it. He said he canceled the secret meeting and called off negotiations. The sudden reversal was classic Trump, impulsive and dramatic. But the talks had come too far to abandon. Within weeks, they quietly resumed. The violence in Afghanistan continued unabated during the negotiations. The Taliban maintained pressure on Afghan forces. They launched attacks across the country. They seized territory in rural areas. They assassinated government officials and security personnel. The Afghan government insisted that any peace deal must include a ceasefire. The Taliban refused. They argued that a ceasefire should come only after political agreements were finalized. The result was that negotiations proceeded while Afghans died. American forces continued their own operations even as peace talks progressed. Special operations raids targeted Taliban and ISIS commanders. Drone strikes killed suspected militants. American air support helped Afghan forces defend against Taliban attacks. The contradiction was stark. America was negotiating its withdrawal with the Taliban while simultaneously fighting them. This dual approach reflected the confused nature of American strategy. No one knew whether the goal was to defeat the Taliban or to negotiate a settlement with them. ISIS emerged as a new threat in Afghanistan during this period. ISIS-Khorasan, or ISISK, was established in 2015 by disaffected Taliban members and foreign fighters. The group was even more extreme than the Taliban. They conducted suicide bombings against civilian targets. They attacked Shia mosques, schools, and hospitals. They sought to ignite sectarian conflict. The Taliban and ISIS-K were enemies. They fought each other in some areas. But their shared hostility to the Afghan government and foreign forces made them de facto allies against the government. The ISIS-K threat complicated American strategy. The organization demonstrated that even if the Taliban could be trusted regarding al-Qaeda, other terrorist groups could still operate in Afghanistan. This undermined the argument that negotiating with the Taliban would eliminate the terrorist threat. American officials argued that the Taliban had incentives to prevent ISIS-K from operating because the group threatened Taliban authority. But this argument required trusting the Taliban to police Afghanistan against terrorism. Many were skeptical. The 2019 presidential election in Afghanistan added another layer of complexity. The election was repeatedly delayed by technical and security problems. When voting finally occurred in September 2019, turnout was extremely low. Less than 20% of registered voters participated. The results were delayed for months amid accusations of fraud. President Ghani was eventually declared the winner, but his rival, Abdullah, rejected the results and declared himself the winner. Afghanistan faced the prospect of two competing presidents just as the peace process reached its critical phase. The disputed election paralyzed the Afghan government at the worst possible moment. Ghani and Abdullah both claimed to be president. Both held inauguration ceremonies in March 2020. American officials had to shuttle between the two camps trying to broker a power-sharing deal. The spectacle damaged Afghanistan's credibility and strengthened the Taliban's narrative that the government was illegitimate. It showed that even after decades of international support, Afghanistan's political institutions remained fragile and dysfunctional. On February 29, 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed an agreement in Doha. The agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan outlined the terms for American withdrawal. The United States committed to reducing forces to 8,600 within 135 days and to complete withdrawal within 14 months. The Taliban committed to preventing terrorist groups from using Afghan soil to threaten America and its allies. They committed to beginning intra-Afghan negotiations. Prisoner releases would occur as confidence-building measures. The agreement was historic but deeply flawed. It committed America to withdrawal on a fixed timeline, regardless of conditions on the ground. The Taliban's commitments were vague and unenforceable. There was no mechanism to verify Taliban compliance. There was no provision for a ceasefire. The agreement barely mentioned the Afghan government. The document referred to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is not recognized by the United States as a state, giving the Taliban official recognition without acknowledging their legitimacy. President Ghani was furious about the agreement. His government had not been consulted on its final terms. He particularly objected to the provision requiring release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners. He argued that prisoner releases should be part of intra-Afghan negotiations, not a precondition for them. The Taliban insisted the releases must occur before negotiations could begin. The dispute delayed the start of intra-Afghan talks for months. The COVID-19 pandemic hit Afghanistan in early 2020, adding a public health crisis to the ongoing conflict. Afghanistan's healthcare system was already overwhelmed by conflict casualties. It was completely unprepared for a pandemic. Testing capacity was minimal. Hospitals lacked ventilators and protective equipment. The government struggled to implement lockdowns or social distancing measures. The pandemic spread through a population that was already suffering from malnutrition, displacement, and trauma. The pandemic's impact on the war was complex. Violence initially decreased during the early months as fighters on all sides dealt with the virus. But the Taliban quickly adapted. They used the pandemic to demonstrate their governance capacity. Taliban commanders distributed medical supplies in areas they controlled. They enforced lockdowns in Taliban territories. They portrayed themselves as more effective than the government. The pandemic became another arena of competition between the government and the Taliban. Intra-Afghan negotiations finally began in Doha in September 2020 after months of delay. The opening session was ceremonial and optimistic. Representatives of the Afghan government and the Taliban sat across from each other for the first time. They posed for photographs and made speeches about peace. But the substantive negotiations that followed made little progress. The two sides could not agree on basic procedures, let alone substantive issues. Talks stalled repeatedly over minor procedural questions. The fundamental divide was irreconcilable. The Afghan government wanted to preserve the democratic constitution and institutions built over 2 decades. They wanted to protect women's rights and civil liberties. They wanted a power-sharing arrangement that preserved their role. The Taliban wanted to restore the Islamic Emirate they had governed in the 1990s. They rejected democracy as un-Islamic. They insisted on implementing their interpretation of Islamic law. They wanted complete control of Afghanistan. These positions were incompatible. The 2020 American presidential election brought another shift in Afghanistan policy. Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump. Biden had been vice president during the Obama administration's surge and withdrawal. He had opposed the surge at the time, arguing for a limited counterterrorism mission instead. As president, Biden inherited the Doha Agreement signed by Trump. He faced a choice: honor the agreement and withdraw, or repudiate it and remain in Afghanistan indefinitely. Biden chose to honor the withdrawal commitment, but extended the timeline. In April 2021, he announced that all American forces would withdraw by September 11, 2021, the 20th anniversary of the attacks that had triggered the war. He argued that the mission had achieved its original objective of preventing attacks on America from Afghanistan. He said nation building had never been the goal. He acknowledged that Afghanistan's future was uncertain, but insisted it was time for Afghans to determine their own fate. The announcement triggered immediate reactions. Afghan government officials pleaded with Biden to reconsider. They warned that the Afghan security forces would collapse without American support. They predicted the Taliban would seize power. Human rights activists warned that women and minorities would suffer under Taliban rule. Veterans groups expressed anguish that their sacrifices might be for nothing, but Biden was unmoved. He had decided that the war was unwinnable and that further American presence was futile. The withdrawal began immediately. American forces started closing bases and shipping equipment home. Bagram Air Base, the massive American facility north of Kabul, was quietly evacuated in July 2021. Local Afghan commanders were not informed of the exact timing. They arrived one morning to find the Americans gone. The abandonment of Bagram symbolized the chaotic nature of the withdrawal. The base had been the nerve center of American operations for 2 decades. Now it was handed over in the middle of the night without ceremony. As American forces withdrew, Afghan security forces began to collapse. The collapse was not gradual, it was sudden and catastrophic. Districts fell to the Taliban in rapid succession. Provincial capitals came under siege. Afghan soldiers surrendered or fled. Entire units disintegrated without fighting. The reasons for the collapse were complex but clear in hindsight. Afghan forces had been built to depend on American air support, intelligence, and logistics. When those supports were withdrawn, the system collapsed. Corruption played a crucial role in the collapse. Ghost soldiers who existed only on paper meant units were far weaker than reported. Commanders who pocketed their men's salaries created units with no loyalty or morale. Supply chains riddled with corruption meant soldiers lacked food, ammunition, and fuel. When the Taliban attacked, soldiers who had not been paid, who had not eaten, and who had no ammunition had no reason to fight. they surrendered or fled home. The Taliban's strategy during the withdrawal was sophisticated. They avoided attacking American forces to prevent giving Biden a reason to halt the withdrawal. They focused on Afghan forces. Instead, they used a combination of military pressure and political subversion. They negotiated surrender agreements with local commanders and governors. They offered amnesty to those who surrendered and threatened death to those who resisted. Many Afghan officials and commanders took the deals. Entire provinces surrendered without shots fired. The psychological impact of the American withdrawal was devastating. Afghan soldiers and officials felt abandoned. They had been told for years that America stood with them. Now America was leaving. The message was clear. America had decided Afghanistan was not worth fighting for. If America would not fight for Afghanistan, why should Afghans? This sense of abandonment undermined morale and will to fight more than any tactical factor. By August 2021, the Taliban controlled most of Afghanistan. Provincial capitals fell like dominoes. Kandahar, the Taliban's spiritual capital, fell on August 12th. Herat in the west fell the same day. Mazar-i-Sharif in the north, which had held against the Taliban in the 1990s, fell on August 14th. The Afghan government controlled only Kabul and a handful of other cities. President Ghani insisted the Afghan forces would rally and the Taliban advance would stall. He was desperately wrong. On August 15, 2021, the Taliban entered Kabul. There was no battle for the capital. The Taliban met no resistance. Afghan government forces had evaporated. President Ghani fled the country, reportedly taking millions of dollars with him. He later claimed he fled to prevent bloodshed. Many Afghans viewed his flight as the ultimate betrayal. The president who had demanded loyalty had abandoned his post. The government collapsed within hours of his departure. Taliban fighters walked into the presidential palace unopposed. They posed for photographs sitting at the president's desk. They raised their flag over the palace. In a nearby prison, they released thousands of prisoners, including many convicted criminals and terrorists. Across Kabul, government officials burned documents and tried to flee. The scenes recalled the fall of Saigon in 1975. History was repeating itself as tragedy. The American embassy in Kabul became the focus of desperate evacuation efforts. Thousands of Afghans who had worked with Americans tried to reach the embassy. They hoped for evacuation to safety. The scenes were chaotic and heartbreaking. Families with small children pushed through crowds. People waved papers proving their cooperation with America. Many were turned away. The embassy staff was overwhelmed. Plans that had assumed an orderly withdrawal over months had to be executed in days. President Biden ordered American troops back to Kabul to secure the airport for evacuation. Within days, thousands of American soldiers were on the ground at Hamid Karzai International Airport. Their mission was to hold the airport long enough to evacuate American citizens and at-risk Afghans. The Taliban surrounded the airport but did not attack. They knew that attacking Americans would invite retaliation. They were patient. They knew they had already won. The scenes at Kabul airport in August 2021 shocked the world. Thousands of desperate Afghans crowded the perimeter, hoping for evacuation. Many had worked for the American military or embassy. Others were journalists, human rights activists, or simply people who feared Taliban rule. They pushed against the gates. They waved documents. They held up children. The crush was dangerous and chaotic. People were trampled. Children were separated from parents. The desperation was palpable and heartbreaking. The images that emerged from the airport became iconic symbols of the war's end. A C-17 transport aircraft taxied down the runway with people clinging to its sides. When the plane took off, several people fell to their deaths. The footage was broadcast around the world. It recalled desperate scenes from the fall of Saigon decades earlier. The comparison was obvious and painful. America was once again fleeing a failed war while desperate allies begged for rescue. American forces established a security perimeter at the airport. They controlled the gates and processed people for evacuation. The operation was massive and unprecedented. Military transport aircraft flew continuously, taking off and landing every few minutes. Each plane carried hundreds of evacuees. Over the course of 2 weeks, the United States evacuated more than 120,000 people. It was the largest airlift in American history. But it was also chaotic, dangerous, and incomplete. Many who deserved evacuation were left behind. The Taliban controlled everything outside the airport perimeter. They set up checkpoints on the roads leading to the airport. They checked people's documents and decided who could pass. Many Afghans were turned away. Some were beaten. The Taliban claimed they were checking for criminals and terrorists. But they were also screening for people who had worked against them. Despite promises of amnesty, many feared retribution. The Taliban's checkpoints made evacuation even more difficult. The Biden administration faced fierce criticism for the chaotic withdrawal. Republicans accused Biden of incompetence and betrayal. Some Democrats joined the criticism. Military officials leaked their frustrations to the press. They argued that the withdrawal had been rushed and poorly planned. Intelligence assessments that had predicted the Afghan government would last months proved catastrophically wrong. The government had lasted only days. The speed of collapse surprised everyone, though in hindsight the warning signs had been evident. Biden defended his decision with anger and defiance. He argued that the choice was between withdrawal and escalation. He said that staying longer would only postpone the inevitable collapse. He blamed the Afghan government and military for not fighting. He blamed Trump for signing the Doha Agreement that committed America to withdrawal. He insisted that ending the war was the right decision, even if the execution was imperfect. His approval ratings plummeted. The withdrawal became a defining failure of his presidency. On August 26, 2021, disaster struck the evacuation operation. A suicide bomber from ISIS-K attacked a crowd at Abbey Gate, one of the airport's entrance points. The explosion killed 13 American service members and approximately 170 Afghan civilians. It was the deadliest attack on American forces in Afghanistan in over a decade. The wounded were rushed to makeshift medical facilities at the airport. The scene was carnage. Bodies littered the ground. The injured screamed in pain. Blood mixed with the dust. The ISIS-K attack demonstrated the continuing terrorist threat in Afghanistan. The group sought to disrupt the evacuation and embarrass the Taliban. They succeeded on both counts. The attack forced temporary suspension of evacuation flights. Security was tightened further. The Taliban proved unable or unwilling to prevent the attack despite controlling the area around the airport. The attack underscored the dangerous security environment and the questionable wisdom of relying on Taliban cooperation. American forces conducted a drone strike in Kabul days after the Abbey Gate attack. The strike was said to target ISIS-K planners preparing another attack on the airport. Military officials initially claimed the strike killed terrorists and prevented an attack. But investigations later revealed the strike had actually killed an innocent aid worker and 9 members of his family, including 7 children. The mistaken strike was a final tragic punctuation mark on 20 years of errors and misjudgments. The evacuation ended on August 31, 2021. The last American aircraft departed Kabul airport just before midnight. Major General Chris Donahue, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, was the last American soldier to board the last aircraft. A photograph captured him walking up the ramp in night vision green. The image became the defining visual of America's departure. 20 years of war ended with an overnight flight into darkness. The Taliban immediately took control of the airport after the Americans left. They celebrated their victory with gunfire and speeches. They raised their flag over the terminal. They inspected the equipment left behind. The Americans had disabled aircraft and vehicles before leaving, but enormous amounts of military equipment fell into Taliban hands. Weapons, vehicles, helicopters, and drones were now Taliban property. The sight of Taliban fighters posing with American equipment was humiliating. Thousands of Afghans who had supported America were left behind. Despite the massive evacuation effort, many interpreters, contractors, and others who had worked with coalition forces remained in Afghanistan. They went into hiding. They destroyed documents linking them to Americans. They changed their phone numbers. They grew beards. They tried to blend in. They lived in fear of Taliban retribution. American veterans groups and non-profits worked frantically to help them escape through neighboring countries. The humanitarian situation in Afghanistan deteriorated rapidly. International aid dried up. The United States froze billions of dollars in Afghan government assets held in American banks. The World Bank and IMF suspended funding. Humanitarian organizations faced restrictions on operations. The economy, which had been sustained largely by international aid, collapsed. Government salaries stopped. Banks limited withdrawals. Inflation soared. Food prices skyrocketed. Millions faced hunger. The country that had already been one of the world's poorest was now facing catastrophe. Women and girls suffered particularly severe restrictions under renewed Taliban rule. Despite promises of moderation, the Taliban quickly reimposed harsh restrictions. Girls' secondary schools were closed. Women were barred from most employment. They could not travel without male guardians. They had to wear burqas in public. Female judges, doctors, teachers, and other professionals lost their positions. A generation of women who had grown up with education and opportunity saw their futures destroyed overnight. The Taliban announced a government that was entirely male and dominated by Pashtuns. The cabinet included no women, no minorities, and no members of the previous government. Several ministers were on UN terrorism watch lists. Sirajuddin Haqqani, leader of the Haqqani network designated as a terrorist organization, became interior minister. The government looked remarkably similar to the Taliban regime of the 1990s. The promises of an inclusive government proved empty. The international community faced difficult choices about recognizing the Taliban government. No country formally recognized the new regime initially, but many began pragmatic engagement. Pakistan, China, Russia, and Iran sent delegations to Kabul. They pursued their interests even without formal recognition. The United States maintained that recognition would depend on Taliban actions regarding terrorism, human rights, and inclusive government. But American leverage was minimal after withdrawal. Al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan remained a concern despite Taliban promises. Intelligence reports indicated that Al-Qaeda leaders were living in Afghanistan under Taliban protection. In July 2022, an American drone strike killed Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda's leader, in a house in Kabul. He had been living there under apparent Taliban protection. The strike proved the Taliban had violated the Doha Agreement's counter-terrorism provisions. But America's ability to respond was limited without forces on the ground. The cost of the 20-year war was staggering in every dimension. Approximately 2,461 American service members died in Afghanistan. Another 20,744 were wounded. More than 1,100 coalition troops from other nations died. Thousands of American contractors, many of them former soldiers, also died. The human cost to Afghans was far greater. Estimates suggest over 66,000 Afghan military and police were killed. At least 48,000 Afghan civilians died from direct war violence. The true toll was likely much higher. Millions were displaced or became refugees. The financial cost exceeded $1 trillion. This included direct military spending, reconstruction aid, veteran care, and interest on borrowed war funds. The money could have rebuilt America's infrastructure, funded education, or addressed countless other needs. Instead, it was spent on a war that ended in failure. The waste and corruption were legendary. Billions disappeared into the pockets of contractors, warlords, and corrupt officials. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction documented years of failed projects and squandered resources. The strategic consequences of the war's failure were profound. American credibility was damaged globally. Allies questioned America's commitment and reliability. Adversaries were emboldened. The perception that America would inevitably withdraw from difficult situations shaped calculations in capitals worldwide. The withdrawal from Afghanistan encouraged aggression by others. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was partly influenced by perceptions of American weakness displayed in Afghanistan. The veterans of the Afghanistan war returned home to a country that largely ignored their service and sacrifice. Unlike Vietnam veterans who were sometimes treated with hostility, Afghanistan veterans were treated with indifference. The war had become background noise to most Americans. The all-volunteer military meant that less than 1% of Americans served. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were fought by a small military class, while the rest of society pursued normal life. This disconnect created isolation and resentment among veterans. Many veterans struggled with the knowledge that their sacrifices had been for nothing. They had been told they were fighting for freedom and democracy. They had watched friends die and had themselves been wounded. Now the Taliban controlled Afghanistan again. The government they had fought for had collapsed. The people they had tried to help were suffering under the same regime that had sheltered bin Laden. The sense of futility and betrayal was overwhelming for many. Veteran suicide rates were tragically high. The lessons of Afghanistan were debated intensely. Some argued the war proved that counterinsurgency and nation-building were impossible. They believed America should focus on narrow counter-terrorism objectives and avoid attempts at political transformation. Others argued that the war could have been won with different strategies and more sustained commitment. They blamed political leaders for setting unrealistic timelines and undermining military efforts. Still others argued the war should never have been fought beyond the initial defeat of the Taliban in 2001. The parallels to Vietnam were obvious but imperfect. Both wars involved powerful America fighting insurgents in difficult terrain. Both involved corrupt and unpopular allied governments. Both ended with chaotic withdrawals and abandoned allies. Both left questions about American judgment and staying power. But the differences were also significant. Afghanistan was less costly in American lives. The draft made Vietnam a more divisive domestic issue. The geopolitical consequences of Vietnam's fall were less severe than feared. The question of whether America should have remained in Afghanistan divided opinion. Those favoring continued presence argued that a small American force could have prevented the government's collapse at modest cost. They pointed to ongoing American presence in Korea and Germany as examples of successful long-term commitments. They argued that the cost of withdrawal, including humanitarian disaster and terrorist resurgence, exceeded the cost of staying. This position was particularly strong among Afghan refugees and American veterans. Those favoring withdrawal argued that 20 years was enough time to achieve any achievable goals. They contended that the Afghan government and military were fundamentally unsustainable. They would have collapsed eventually regardless of when America left. Staying longer only postponed the inevitable while costing more lives and money. They argued that Afghanistan was never vital to American security. The focus should have always been narrowly on preventing terrorist attacks, which could be done without occupying the country. The Afghanistan papers, published by the Washington Post in 2019, revealed that American officials had consistently misled the public about the war's progress. Confidential interviews with officials involved in the war effort showed that many knew the war was unwinnable. They publicly expressed optimism while privately acknowledging failure. Metrics were manipulated to show progress. Problems were downplayed. Each new commander and strategy was presented as the key to success. The pattern of deception spanned for presidential administrations. The failure in Afghanistan reflected deeper problems in American foreign policy and military institutions. The military was optimized for conventional warfare, but struggled with counterinsurgency. Intelligence agencies focused on tactical targeting, but failed strategic assessment. Development agencies pursued projects that looked good on PowerPoint, but failed on the ground. The bureaucracy rewarded spending money and claiming progress. There were no incentives for honest assessment or for declaring that objectives were unachievable. The war also revealed the limits of military power in achieving political objectives. America possessed overwhelming military superiority. American forces won every significant battle. But military success did not translate into political stability or sustainable governance. The ability to destroy could not create the ability to build. This lesson had been learned and forgotten repeatedly in American history. Afghanistan joined a long list of conflicts where military power proved insufficient. Afghanistan's future under Taliban rule remained uncertain and bleak. The regime faced economic crisis, drought, and international isolation. They struggled to provide basic services. They faced opposition from ISIS-K and ethnic minorities. They imposed repressive policies that alienated educated urban populations. The government they had destroyed had been corrupt and ineffective. But at least it had been connected to the international community and received support. The Taliban's isolation left Afghanistan more desperate than ever. The plight of Afghan women under Taliban rule became a symbol of the war's failure. Girls who had grown up attending school now stayed home. Women professionals who had careers now could not leave their houses without permission. Female students were barred from universities. The promise that the war would liberate Afghan women had been central to its justification. The return of Taliban rule represented the complete reversal of that promise. The suffering of Afghan women was a daily reminder of the war's futility. 20 years after the September 11th attacks, America had come full circle. The Taliban controlled Afghanistan again. Terrorist groups operated in Afghan territory again. American forces were gone. Thousands had died. Trillions had been spent. What had been achieved? The destruction of Al-Qaeda's safe haven had been temporary. Bin Laden had been killed, but in Pakistan, not through the war in Afghanistan. Democratic institutions had been built, then collapsed. Women had been liberated, then reoppressed. The return to the starting point was almost complete. The question that haunted everyone connected to the war was simple. Was it worth it? For the families of the fallen, no answer could be satisfying. Their loved ones had died in service to their country. That sacrifice was honorable regardless of the war's outcome. But the failure to achieve lasting results made the grief harder to bear. For the veterans who survived, the question was agonizing. They had given years of their lives, parts of their bodies, and pieces of their souls. For what? The Afghanistan War was America's longest conflict. It spanned for presidential administrations. An entire generation grew up during the war. Children born on September 11, 2001, were old enough to serve in Afghanistan before the war ended. The war became background noise, an ongoing operation that most Americans forgot about most of the time. Only when casualties occurred or the war made news did it briefly return to public consciousness. This indifference was itself a failure of civic responsibility. The war also represented a failure of the all-volunteer force concept. Without a draft, wars could continue indefinitely without broad public engagement. The burden fell on a small segment of society that served repeatedly. Multiple deployments became normal. Soldiers and Marines deployed to Afghanistan 3, 4, or 5 times. This placed enormous strain on service members and their families. It also meant that most Americans had no stake in whether the war continued or ended. The disconnect between the military and society enabled the war's endless continuation. The contractors who played such a large role in the war effort deserve examination. Private military contractors performed tasks that soldiers once performed. They provided security, training, logistics, and intelligence support. At some points, contractors outnumbered American military personnel in Afghanistan. Their role was controversial. Contractors were expensive but politically convenient. They did not appear in military casualty counts. Their presence allowed the government to understate the true scale of American involvement. The aid workers, journalists, and diplomats who served in Afghanistan also paid prices. Many were killed by attacks or accidents. Others suffered trauma from the violence they witnessed. They worked in incredibly difficult conditions trying to help Afghanistan develop. Many became deeply committed to the country and its people. The failure of their efforts was personally devastating. They had believed their work was building a better future. The collapse of everything they had worked for was a profound personal loss. The war changed how Americans viewed military intervention. The post-September 11th unity that had supported the war dissolved long ago. Public support for nation building evaporated. The idea that America could democratize the Middle East, which had driven the Iraq War, was thoroughly discredited. The experience in Afghanistan contributed to a broader turn toward restraint in American foreign policy. The appetite for military adventures declined dramatically. This shift had significant implications for America's global role. The legacy of the Afghanistan War will be debated for generations. Historians will analyze what went wrong and whether different choices could have produced different outcomes. They will examine the decisions made by 4 presidents and countless military and civilian officials. They will study the strategies attempted and abandoned. They will interview veterans and refugees. They will read the documents and reports. Slowly, a fuller picture will emerge. But some questions will never have satisfying answers.